The Sakura Wars series has always worn its anime influences on its sleeve. It was about as close as you could get to a fully playable anime at the time, what with its episodic narrative structure, title card drops, commercial break eye-catch screens as save checkpoints, next episode previews, voice casts comprised of voice acting all-stars from the 80s and 90s, and atypically large amounts of animated cutscenes. It was only natural, then, that the series would branch out into proper long-form animation, starting with the OVA series Oka Kendan, The Gorgeous Blooming Cherry Blossoms if you're nasty, released in 4 parts from December 1997 to July 1998, and the follow-up OVA Goka Kendan, or The Radiant Gorgeous Blooming Cherry Blossoms, released from December 1999 to December 2000. Following that was the Sakura Wars TV anime, broadcast throughout the year 2000, after which was the series' big silver screen debut, Sakura Wars the Movie, released on December 22nd, 2001. From a Western perspective, one of the most notable things about these various animated entries in the franchise is that, for years, these were the only officially released Sakura Wars media in the Americas and PAL territories.
We have been waiting quite some time to get our hands on Sakura Wars, and we've got it for you now, and it's all in this evening.
Yeah, we received these spin-offs without any greater context from the games, which in hindsight is really weird. Oka Kendan, released in the West in 1999 as just Sakura Wars, is mostly a prequel series, detailing how the girls made their way to the review in the first place. While that sounds like it'd be a great entry point into the series, it makes no effort to explain who these characters are or why anything that's happening is important. Like, Tenkai, Satan, and the Hive show up for a grand total of 1 scene in the 3rd episode, with no real explanation as to who they even are, and then are never seen again. It very much assumes you played Sakura Wars 1 beforehand. You'd think that would have deterred the Western audience, but it nonetheless managed to develop a following, so hey, what the hell do I know? On the other hand, Goka Kendan, released in the West in 2002 as just Sakura Wars again, is a series of mostly one-off short stories focusing on specific character pairings, where the greater context of the games doesn't matter too much. While both series are considered canon, with Goka Kendan in particular being quite delightful, neither are exactly required viewing. You won't ever find yourself getting lost in the plot while playing the games if you choose to ignore them. Meanwhile, the TV anime, released in the West in 2003 as just Sakura Wars again, is a very loose retelling of the first game that's, a bit of a tonal shift from the main games. It doesn't even remotely fit into the canon, so suffice it to say, it's not required viewing for following along with the overall story either. Hearing all this, you'd be forgiven then for thinking the same would apply to the movie. After all, you think animated movie set in a Japanese game or anime franchise, you think of countless filler stories that are never brought up in canon and often retconned out of relevance, but no, not this time. Written and directed by Mitsuru Hongo, whom you might recognize for his work on the Outlaw Star anime, with supervision from main series writer Satoru Akahori and series creator Oji Hiroi, this movie's actually weirdly important in the overall lore. Rather than worrying about whether the movie is required viewing for later games, though, what might be the more important concern in the immediate short term is the movie any good? And, no. Not really. It's often drab and ugly looking, the pacing's all over the place, it's unfocused, it suffers from weird writing decisions, it's just generally kind of unpleasant. This isn't to say there aren't enjoyable moments or good-looking shots. I mean, hell, this movie's filled to bursting with Sakuga frames. But by and large, I'm just not a fan of this movie. It's especially disappointing considering this was made by Production IG, the same studio responsible for the spectacular openings for both Sakura Wars 2 and 3, with the 3D CG work being done by IKIF+, the studio responsible for the CG work in said openings. As the story goes, during the development of Sakura Wars 3, when Oji Hiroi saw the game's opening for the first time, he exclaimed, "You can make a whole movie like this!" Production IG co-founder Mitsuhisa Ishikawa, however, initially had his doubts, thinking it wouldn't be feasible. And maybe he was right. There will be spoilers from this point on, but lucky for you, as of this recording, the English Region A Blu-ray is cheap and readily accessible, plus it's currently available on Crunchyroll. The movie's only a brisk 85 minutes long, so just pause this video and come back when you're done. It's cool, I'll wait. You done? What'd you think? Yeah, I thought as much. Anyhow, because I know some of you out there probably didn't watch it, I'll give an extremely brief overview before we really dive into it. Keep in mind the naming conventions and localization choices in the subs are very different from what you're probably used to. It's late 1926, year 15 of the alternate Taisho era. Due to the trip from Paris to Tokyo taking long as hell at the time, Ogami's still on his way back, and so the Flower Division continue their duties without him. Maria's currently assuming the role of acting captain, essentially picking up from where she had left off back when Ogami showed up in the first place. Things are generally peaceful, but much like with the black ships of Commodore Perry, a bunch of Americans arrive to shake things up. First up is a woman by the name of Ratchet Altair. Yeah, this movie's localization tries to pass her name off as Lachette, but I'm sorry girl, you're just Ratchet. Her big thing, as she makes abundantly clear throughout the film, is efficiency. She's a girl boss out to get results. She's here to report to Yoneda that not only has the formation of a New York Combat Review been formally approved by the Elders Institute, but she'll be joining the Imperial Combat Review for some on-the-job training. That said, this isn't exactly her first rodeo. Remember the Star Division, the short-lived precursor to the current combat reviews? Well, their captain was none other than Ratchet herself, and Kaede, who was their commanding officer, recalls that Ratchet didn't take its dissolution particularly well at the time. Oh yeah, I should also probably explain who the Elders Institute are, since I never really brought them up before now. They're a secret organization acting as what's basically the board of directors for the review, with their most notable member being one Count Hanakoji. Remember that old guy Ogami talks to at the very beginning of Sakura Wars 1, who also shows up a couple of times throughout Sakura Wars 2? Yeah, that guy. Anyhow, the other American of interest is a fella by the name of Brent Furlong, CEO of the Douglas Stewart Corporation. He's ostensibly here for philanthropic reasons, but, surprise, he just wants to take over the country. Aw, but he looks so trustworthy. Brent's bidding is carried out by his masked manservant, an undead black magician with a habit of speaking in some funky-sounding English.
Let's lay the cards now. Otherwise, man, sir. I never going to say that, sir.
His name is Patrick. I'm serious. Patrick the Dark Wizard.
I'm not a Krusty Krab.
Patrick kicks things off by summoning some demons to attack a historic neighborhood, with its traditional Japanese wooden architecture quickly going up in flames. The Flower Division are called on the scene to fight the demons off, only to be shown up by not only Ratchet making a sudden flashy entrance, but an unidentified mystery mech as well. While Maria reports to Yoneda and fills him in on the unidentified— oh god, please don't call them steamers, come on. Yeah, this movie's a real steamer, I tell you what. Ratchet introduces herself to the rest of the team, though it's more of a reintroduction for some of them. Though Orihime seems pleased to get to see her old boss again, Veni is less than thrilled. Back at the Elders Institute, we see a politician by the name of Tanuma giving a PowerPoint presentation on the previously seen mystery mech. It's known as a Yafkiel, a demon-fighting machine from our friends at the Douglas Stewart Corporation. The Yafkiels just so happen to be totally unmanned, and Tanuma enthusiastically proposes retiring the review in favor of them. Even in the alt-history 1920s, you're not safe from getting your job automated. Unsurprisingly, it turns out that Tanuma's on the Douglas Stewart company dime, but he soon learns that, as is typical of self-driving vehicles, they're extremely prone to sudden homicidal failure. Patrick intervenes before Tanuma gets killed by one, causing it to spring a leak. Indeed, this whole operation is a ruse, as the Yafkiels are essentially mechanical Turks. Mechanical Turks full of demon goo! Despite being the Yafkiel's biggest shill, this revelation comes as a bit of a surprise to Tanuma, but Unfortunately for him, he's in no position to back out of the deal. We jump ahead to join the gang out on a Hatsumode New Year's Day shrine visit as we take a moment to indulge in some mild shenanigans and enjoy a bountiful crop of really good Kodan faces. Amidst the festivities, we learn that Ratchet's already landed herself the leading role of their next play, Kaijin Bissell, aka the Sea God's Villa. Following this brief reprieve, the plot kicks into overdrive and the pacing flies completely off the rails. We see another combat mission depicted in this inventive but ultimately unexciting all-cockpit view as Rani and Orihime get their shit rocked, wrecking their Kobukai and forcing them back into their Eisenkleids. This gives Tanuma the perfect opportunity to force the Yafkiels upon the Imperial Combat Review, effectively forcing the Flower Division into the role of grocery store employees that have to babysit the self-checkout machines. Ratchet volunteers to go supervise the next Yafkiel deployment, but Orihime, upset at both the situation and at Ratchet's attitude, insists on going instead. Later that night, Yoneda gets attacked by his sleep paralysis demons and goes missing. Alas, when it rains it pours, as we learn later in the morning that not only is Count Hanakoji nowhere to be found as well, but the military has officially ordered the indefinite suspension of the Imperial Combat Review's duties, with the Flower Division to be moved to the Hanayashiki branch for the time being. As the squad reels from the bad news, they get word of a demon attack, and Orihime leaves for her first day on the job as the Yafkiel commander. However, it turns out that this was all a trap, and... do I even need to say it? Orihime gets kidnapped again. Following the radio silence from Orihime, Maria, who's had her suspicions about the Douglas Stewart Corporation from the very start, decides to infiltrate their main Japanese factory on her own. There she discovers the horrible truth about the Yafkiels. But before she gets the chance to report this to the others, she's discovered by Patrick. Unfortunately, he proves to be immune to conventional weaponry, forcing Maria to make an improvised exit out the window, her fate left unknown. Back at the Hanayashiki branch, the rest of the Flower Division sit around feeling powerless about their plight, as Kodan laments not having been able to give Maria her convenient Patrick-killing bullets before she had left. The group moping session is broken up by Sakura, who suggests, "Fuck it, let's raid the theater and get our shit back." This apparently summons Yokihiko Ota of the Rose Division from the very ether, and he goes on to explain the villain's plot to the girls, rather than, having them figure it out for themselves. Look, we're keeping this movie under 90 minutes come hell or high water. Exposition dump it is. He tells them of an underground waterway that leads back to the theater, which they traverse aboard one of Kodan's inventions, with pods full of upgrade parts for the Kobu in tow. They make their way inside, and as they dispatch armed Douglas Stewart goons, Ratchet starts to show an alarming level of bloodlust which Sakura has to keep in check. Murder is efficient, don't you know? They regroup with Kaede and the Wind Division, who, for some reason, are already dressed up in uniform and manning their stations despite the military's gag order. But, details. Thus, we enter the climax. Brent, who at this point in time is keeping both Yoneda and Count Hanakoji as unwilling house guests, catches on to the Flower Division's scheme and sends a swarm of demons to dispose of them. As they close in on the theater, the girls, whose mechs are equipped with jetpacks of Kodan's making, perch atop a wire-launching device conveniently set up in the courtyard for this specific circumstance, and the final battle begins. After wailing on demons for a bit, the Flower Division's amassed enough spirit power to wipe them out for good, with the help of the Review's spiritual support unit, the Dream Division. If you don't know who they are, I don't blame you. They're mostly only referred to in side material, and the only game that's mentioned them up to this point is Sakura Wars GB, of all things. Anyhow, they help concentrate the girl's spirit power onto Iris, the most spiritually gifted of the Flower Division, who sets off what could basically be described as an anti-demon nuke. A very pretty one at that. But the fight's not over, as a lone Yafkiel shows up to pester them. Reni takes the bait and pursues it, with the others following closely behind. And at their destination, they find Orihime, who has fallen victim to Patrick's mind control. Yet another thing she gets to have in common with Reni alongside the constant kidnappings, I suppose. As Orihime tussles with the rest of the team, Ratchet decides the most efficient course of action would be to snuff her out. But Rennie has some mild objections. Rennie's ultimately fine, but Orihime, apparently still somewhat in control and horrified at the situation, begins to blast herself with lasers until Patrick's mind control is broken, robbing him of his leverage. Around the same time, Brent's non-consensual house party is broken up by Kayama, who informs him that the Moon Division, having been tipped off by Maria, are presently shutting down the Douglas Stewart factory permanently by way of mortar fire, with a little help from the Rose Division. It seems the battle is already won, but Brent quickly makes his getaway in the hands of a massive Yafkiel. As he flies towards the Flower Division, he begins an occultic chant, making the Yafkiels melt together into a giant mass of god-awful CGI. He introduces himself to the girls, gloats for a bit, and lets himself get absorbed into his Mega Yafkiel, which he seemingly immediately regrets, before it in turn gets absorbed into the gooey demonic mecha mass. Things are looking bad, and I don't just mean the CG. Luckily for the Flower Division, help is on the way, but until then, they have to deal with the big bad on their own. Almost immediately, Ratchet eats a big hit and gets sidelined, her Eisenkleid rendered totally inoperable. Before long, everyone's spirit power levels begin to drop off, and Sakura's trapped by Brent's amorphous goo tentacles. As he prepares the killing blow, here comes Ogami with the assist, wielding a goddamn rocket launcher. This upsets the Brent, which is when Koran picks up on the weird melodic noises coming out of him. She deduces that those frequencies are what's controlling his gargantuan body. Disrupt the frequencies, and the whole mass ought to fall apart. The Flower Division begin their counterattack, getting Brent's big metal grabby arms out of the way so Koran can unload a volley of rockets right into the exposed Yafkiel faceplates. As predicted, his fleshy form goes berserk, exposing his gooey center long enough for Sakura to deal the death blow. Brent and the Yafkiels dissolve into a flurry of feathers, Yonetta decks Tanema in the face, and the day is saved. As the morning sun rolls in, an injured Maria tracks down a fleeing Patrick and finally places one of the convenient Patrick-killing bullets right between his eyes, ensuring we'll never see him ever again. All's well that ends well. But wait, we still have a play to put on. The Flower Division performance of Kaijin Bissell goes smoothly, right up until Ratchet's character, the Prince, declares his intent to slay his betrothed, portrayed by Sakura. When asked to explain why, Ratchet suddenly veers wildly off script, alerting the others backstage. While remaining in character as the Prince, Ratchet starts alluding to having sold her soul to demons after having lost everything, feeling shame in having done so. In actuality, she's secretly confessing to having been in cahoots with Brent, and her resulting self-loathing is making her lash out, threatening a murder-suicide. Sakura, despite being in very real danger here, remains the consummate professional and plays along, saying she forgives the Prince for his transgressions. The others join in, forgiving the Prince one by one, but in the end, Ratchet takes her swing. Though she drew blood, she ultimately couldn't bring herself to kill Sakura, having been won over by her forgiveness. They agree to let bygones be bygones and reconcile, with the audience none the wiser as the curtain falls, both on the play and the movie itself. The end. So, now that we're all caught up, there's a few things in particular I wanted to discuss. First, as I'm sure some of you who watched the movie yourselves may have noticed, this movie's got an English dub. On its own merits, the dub is largely fine. It's a Pioneer Entertainment dub from the early aughts, which means you get to hear a lot of familiar voices from that era.
There's no place I'd rather be than right here, right now.
Now sit back and watch. I'm gonna make that thing go to pieces.
Oh, Miss Maria! Well, what a coincidence.
You needn't worry anymore. We've completely secured the perimeter of the building.
Personally, though, after having played so many of the games in Japanese, watching it with English voices feels like having a tuning fork jammed into my brain. It's just incredibly jarring to me. But hey, your mileage may vary. If nothing else, I think we can all agree it's better than the OVA dubs that preceded it.
We don't want to make things any worse than they already are.
Make fun if it makes you happy, Orihime. Oh, Kanna's right. They will be very sad.
Regardless of whether you're watching the sub or the dub, though, A lot of the English localized naming conventions are completely different from what they are nowadays. Being a movie based on a game series that, at that point, had never come out in English, it makes sense then that a lot of it feels as though the localization staff had zero knowledge of the original games to work off of. For example, you get everyone awkwardly referring to each other as Miss, which comes off as way more stilted and overly formal in English than their usage of san, or hun, does in Japanese, betraying a lack of understanding of the characters' interpersonal relationships. Plus, you also get flubs for proper real-world names, like the Hanayashiki amusement park's name being changed to Flower Mansion. The kinds of mistakes that likely would have been avoided had online search engines been a bit more robust than they were then. Kind of annoying, but I get it. Not a huge deal. What's of greater concern and much harder to ignore is how this movie looks, for better and for worse. At its best, the movie is gorgeous, rich with details that really cement it in its time period in a way that not even the games can regularly accomplish. For instance, in the opening sequence where we see Ratchet walking down the Ginza streets at night, you really get a sense of the particular Taisho-era blend of Japanese and Western culture, with the advertisements, the contrasting fashions, and even basic modes of transport. The sequence immediately afterward with the Flower Division performing the Miracle Bells from Sakura Wars 2 is also quite impressive. A total Sakuga flex as the camera pans and sweeps around the girls during their performance without ever once stopping. That being said, the sequence does feel a little excessive, and that indulgence is really at the core of all this movie's problems. For as much as this movie goes beyond what the games could normally depict, it sometimes runs completely counter to what was depicted in the games. For example, take the theater itself. It looks so outrageously opulent. It's never looked this fancy at all before, not in the games nor in the OVAs. Look, I know Orihime used to be a Japan-hating turbo racist, but you're telling me this is the place she was calling a shabby dump in Sakura Wars 2? And it's not like they make it look like this in Sakura Wars 4 either, so why even bother with this extreme makeover? You get the sense that this movie is so eager to impress you by flexing its budget and technical prowess, even if it means compromising not just the established world building and environmental design, but the core storytelling itself, how the movie is made at a fundamental level. Take, for instance, the scene where the Flower Division suits up and deploys following the demon attack early in the film. We get to see the whole deployment process from hopping into the Kobu to loading onto the train, to the train leaving base, in exhaustive detail. I'm not kidding about the exhaustive part either, because holy shit, this part of the movie takes for fucking ever. There's a reason the train sequences are relatively brief in the games, even putting CD storage concerns aside. Keeping them short and snappy helps preserve a sense of urgency to the situation. Sure, for 2001 this looks kinda nice, I suppose. I get why you'd be tempted to spend so much time showing this off, and there is a certain appeal to getting a closer look at the logistical intricacies of the review's operations. But the way they do it here just completely sucks up all the tension from this moment. From the start of the deployment to them arriving at the scene of the battle, it takes about 4.5 minutes. And sure, 5 minutes of fluff might not sound like much of a problem on paper, but when the movie is only 85 minutes long, it becomes kind of a problem. Something's gotta give to compensate for it. And nowhere in the movie is it more obvious than what follows the Hatsumode shrine visit scene. To recap, Reni and Orihime sustain heavy damage in combat. Tanama uses this as an excuse to force Yafkiel's chaperone duty upon the Flower Division. Orihime gets mad and volunteers to lead the Yafkiels herself. Yoneda gets kidnapped by Patrick. The military orders the suspension of the Imperial Combat Review. And finally, Orihime oversees a Yafkiel deployment and gets kidnapped. All of the moments I just described happen in the span of almost exactly 5 minutes. That's right. They spend 5 minutes going over every meticulous detail of the review's deployment process, only to spend just as much time speedrunning a shitload of actual storytelling, like it was a chore they had to get out of the way. It doesn't even stop there either. There are only 7 minutes between the girls getting kicked out of the theater and them reclaiming it. We can't even maintain the tension of their lives being upended and their futures being cast in doubt because the issue gets resolved almost immediately thereafter. The movie's narrative priorities are completely out of whack, and the pacing flies straight off the rails as a consequence. Relatively speaking, shit that really doesn't matter gets given way more screen time than shit that actually does. It gets so bad that the majority of the main cast, including our main heroine Sakura herself, aren't even given time to be active participants in their own story. They don't know what's going on or who they're even fighting until Yukihiko shows up to explain the entire plot to them 5 minutes before the final battle. Like, imagine if Luke Skywalker only learned who Darth Vader was minutes before he hopped in the X-Wing to blow up the Death Star. Perhaps you could argue the same about the shrine visit scene, that it's just wasting what little time they have, but at least that scene has characters interacting, it provides levity, it lets the characters grow on us more so that, in theory, what happens to them later on affects us more. There's a human element in there that, say, the train scene, sorely lacks to justify its length. At this point, you're probably thinking, boy, they really should have made this movie longer. But what if I told you the movie did used to be significantly longer? During a talk show following a screening of the movie on November 3rd, 2016, Shisa Yokoyama, Sakura Shinguji herself, confirmed that the movie was originally going to be over 120 minutes long. So, what changed? Well, during production, it was decided that the movie was going to be the main event of the winter Kadokawa anime Quadruple feature. Besides the film itself, there was the 30-minute short film Slayer's Premium, a 5-minute Azumanga Daioh short, and the 20-minute Digi-Carrot A Trip to the Planet. In order to accommodate all these additional features, it was decided that Sakura Wars the movie would be slashed by over a quarter of its runtime. If you were wondering why the plot of this movie feels so severely undercooked, why they have to cram so much into so little, there's your answer. They took an axe to all the boring talky parts so that they wouldn't have to cut a single second of the Super Neato train scene. Okay, I know I've been harping on the train scene, so I'm gonna stop ranting about it now, but before I do, it must be said, Hiroi is still quite proud of that scene, like as recent as 2013 during a talk to commemorate the film's Blu-ray release. Dude does not regret that decision at all. What's funny is that, during this same talk, Hiroi also admitted that the fight scenes in the movie all take place at night because the darkness hides the flaws of the CGI. Now, this might sound kind of odd, considering how eager the movie is to impress you. Like, why would they want to hide any of it? Well, for as beautiful as the movie can look at times, it is, at other times, ugly as shit in equal measure. The CG looks largely fine when it's something static or something that doesn't have a ton of moving parts, but the Kobu, without hyperbole, the most important CG assets, just look rough. The first fight scene in particular is appallingly bad, like, how did it even ship like this levels of bad? Quick reminder, the CG work in this movie was done by IKIF+, the same CGI studio who worked on the fantastic openings to Sakura Wars 2 and 3, even having the same director for all of them. Your guesses as to why this discrepancy exists at all are as good as mine. This fight lacks any of the special sauce that made those opening sequences from the games sing. The intro to 3 had a lot of dynamic camera work that made it much more visually interesting while masking any flaws the CG elements had, whereas this sequence has unbelievably static and boring cinematography that betrays how crude the models really are. The actual animation of said models doesn't do them any favors either. It's lethargic, clunky, and floaty, a sharp contrast to how kinetic the movements in Ogami's Kobu in 3's opening were, or how impactful and weighty the hits were in 2's opening. Even the effects work looks rough, this hideous CG smoke being chief among them. Thankfully though, it does get a lot better in the final battle. The Kobu are frequently animated on 2s, the shading's way nicer, and effects like the demon blood and smoke are actually hand-drawn, all of which combined make it look far more natural and convincing in a 2D anime movie. That said, some of the hits still look pretty weak and devoid of impact, and the demons... yeah, they just always look like total shit in this movie, I'm sorry. It's not just the CGI that can be distractingly unappealing either. You might not expect it going in blind, but this movie has a surprising amount of body horror. Like, sure, Musashi and the demon weapons at the end of Sakura Wars 2 had some gross, fleshy, techno-organic stuff going on, but you never saw them at quite this level of focus and detail. That's in addition to the fair number of extreme close-ups and unsettling facial expressions that contribute to the movie just being unpleasant to look at times. Even putting the grossness aside, the movie often has this dull, hazy look to it with desaturated colors and bloom lighting. And lastly, we gotta talk about Brent. The villains generally haven't been this series' strong suit, and Brent here does little to buck the trend. He just looks kinda stupid. He's rocking the same haircut as Alessi from Stardust Crusaders, and he's got these goofy little elf ears. Like, say what you will about the King of the Simps, Corbeau from Sakura Wars 3, but at least he was dripped the fuck out. Unfortunately, it's not just in the design that Brent falters, but also how he's fundamentally written. He's just kinda boring. He's often upstaged by his henchman Patrick, who, in addition to a highly distinctive design, has got these nice, creepy mannerisms that make him stand out pretty nicely. Brent here's got precious little in comparison. There's nothing really memorable about him. He's not particularly intimidating, nor is he hammy or charming or anything else that might make him stick in your brain for any extended amount of time. Now, as far as his motives go, Brent's not particularly subtle, he's evil for evil's sake, but not in a way that's especially unrealistic. He's a racist dickbag who wants to lord over a nation whom he deems inferior. He's the very embodiment of callous American imperialism. Look no further than when Patrick begins the firebombing of what is, in stark contrast to the Western-style architecture seen up to this point in the movie, an overtly traditional Japanese neighborhood, and how he reacts by simply saying, "Beautiful." Less clear, however, are Ratchet's motives. The Kaijin Bisso scene is the highlight of the entire movie. It's gripping, it's actually well-paced, and even though I think the trope of the actors on stage are having an actual conversation disguised as a performance is trite and cheesy, it's done very well here. However, though it's a great scene on its own merits, it does lack greater context. We learn through her monologue that Ratchet was secretly in cahoots with Brent, but we still don't really know why. She alludes that she sold her soul to him, but we don't really know what for. What did she even get out of this arrangement? What did she even do for him? Well, to answer that question, we have to do a little homework. There exists a novelization of the movie, written by Sakura Wars OVA screenwriter Hiroyuki Kawasaki. This book actually fleshes out a lot of the underdeveloped aspects of the plot, while also elaborating on the characters' motivations and innermost thoughts. Of particular note, though, are the novel-exclusive prologue and epilogue, where they decided to hide a sizable amount of characterization for both Brent and Ratchet. To summarize, the prologue focuses on an American agent of the Elders Institute, a cowboy hat-wearing fella by the name of Phil Thompson. We follow Phil as he conducts an investigation into both the Imperial and Paris combat reviews in order to create a dossier to be used towards the establishment of a New York combat review. Not long after finally handing the dossier over to Ratchet, he gets caught and summarily killed by Brent and Patrick, who seek the dossier for their own nefarious ends. Brent goes to Ratchet to try to get it from her, and he ultimately succeeds in doing so. It's not until the epilogue, though, that we get insight into how their confrontation went down, as Ratchet confesses her involvement directly to Ogami. Brent, knowing about Ratchet's history as the former captain of the Star Division, likens her situation to that of America's industrial hegemony, at least as it stands in the world of Sakura Wars. Remember all that stuff Koran mentioned offhand back in Sakura Wars 2 about the Confederate Black Wizards during the American Civil War and how the discovery of the lone survivor led to the discovery of Silsa Steel, a metal that can protect against supernatural entities and the material that the Kobu and Eisenkleids are made of? I told you it was going to be important later. Well, the Union used it to make humanoid steam mechs of their own, the precursor to every other mech in this timeline. That's right, America did it first, baby! However, their time on top didn't last long, as they were soon outpaced and left in the dust by Germany and Japan. Brent resents this state of affairs, expressing sympathy towards Ratchet, how, despite being a pioneer herself, she had been left behind as a failure on the road to the establishment of the Imperial and Paris combat reviews. He even goes so far as to claim she won't land the leadership position she feels owed for the eventual New York expansion, that being out of the game for so long has left her with a debt of relevant experience. With all this laid out, Brent proposes a deal. Ratchet gives him the dossier, which he'll use to strengthen America's position in the global mech industry via his company, and in exchange, he has his political connections in Japan, namely Tanima, arrange Ratchet's transfer to the Imperial Combat Review to get that on-the-job experience, so that she would be a shoo-in as head of a future New York Combat Review. Ratchet, having been repeatedly stabbed right in the insecurities, ultimately agrees to this arrangement. Crucially, though, we learn that she was never actually aware of Brent's true plans with the Yathkiels. The extent of their collaboration was merely a mutually beneficial exchange. She wasn't even acting as a mole or saboteur within the review or anything either. She was by no means innocent. She did hand over classified info in the name of nepotism, but her intention to protect Tokyo alongside the others was actually sincere all along. Ratchet goes on to explain to Ogami that once she became aware of Brent and the Yathkiel's true nature, she sought to redeem herself in combat at the cost of her own life. But once her Eisenkleid was rendered inoperable, she was robbed of that chance. As such, during the performance of Kaijin Bisso at the end, having felt as though she had missed her shot at an honorable death, she lashed out at Sakura and things went the way they did. After Ratchet finishes confessing all this to Ogami, she braces for the inevitable punishment. But Ogami, even with the full context of the situation that the rest of the Flower Division lacked, trusts in their judgment and decides to forgive her as well. Ratchet, upon hearing this, breaks down in tears. The following morning, Ogami and Sakura see Ratchet off for her return to America, with Ratchet having found a renewed will to live. Like the film itself already states, Ratchet's bitterness at losing her status and prestige as captain of the Star Division drove her to help out Brent, but without knowing the details, it always felt more like lip service. We couldn't possibly know to what depths she had been driven, nor could we really get a handle on her moral character, so the confession on stage doesn't hold much water in and of itself, and without knowing the severity of her actions, the subsequent round of forgiveness feels perfunctory. As such, just being given that base-level information not only adds a greater context to the Kaijin Bisso scene and helps you feel the full weight of the situation, but it adds layers to Ratchet's character. She wasn't some secretly evil schemer who was swayed to the side of good through the sheer power of forgiveness. She was a decent but prideful person whose self-esteem issues drove her to making a seemingly insignificant but ultimately terrible mistake. When her veneer of confidence is smashed, she resents her failings and it makes her act rashly, be it handing over classified documents in an attempt to save face, or hijacking a play to run from the shame eating her up inside. Granted, it still would have been better to sprinkle some of this information throughout the movie rather than backloading all of it at once, but hey, I'll take it where I can get it, you know? In addition to giving Ratchet some tangible character motivations, what's also remarkable about this epilogue is that it actually makes Brent feel kinda human too. It doesn't justify what he does in any way, God no, but he has an actual reason for doing what he's doing beyond because I'm evil, something which the film has trouble communicating. The root of Brent's motivation is a sense of entitlement, the idea that since America built mechs first, why shouldn't they remain on top forever and reap the spoils? He's completely mind-poisoned by this ideology, to the point where he abandons his humanity in an attempt to ensure Japan can't reap any of the benefits either. This is your brain on American exceptionalism. Any questions? However, the story, at least as presented in the novel along with the extra context, does a good job of threading the needle of criticizing the American imperialist mindset without demonizing Americans as an overall people. The series has always championed multiculturalism and rejected isolationist nationalism, and hell, the novel goes so far as to have Izumi Kyoka, the author of Kaijin Bisso, remind Yoneda that his original work, despite appearing overtly Japanese on its surface, is itself the product of intercultural exchange, that it owes much of its existence to the play The Sunken Bell by Gerhard Hauptmann. That said, There is that one weird bit near the end, though, when Yoneda punches out Tanuma and suggests the girl's Japanese pride is what gives them strength. Which, like, what? Patriotism and national allegiances have never been a factor for them. Hell, that is explicitly stated in the text in Sakura Wars 3, so where the fuck did this come from? The movie we wound up getting is, honestly, kind of a hot mess. It's rushed, it's ugly a lot of the time, and it's thin. It's a bad movie with a few bright flashes, like the Kaijin Bisso sequence, which frankly deserves a better movie than this. However, as a novel, it's actually okay. It still suffers from many of the film's structural and pacing issues. It doesn't diverge too much in that department, but the scenes unique to it are so additive that it's kinda crazy to think they're not in the actual movie. It's unclear if all that extra context was something invented after the fact, or if it was taken from the 40 minutes that had to be cut from the movie, but either way, I think it ultimately improves upon it. The prologue's framing device with Phil's a good way to get newcomers up to speed with the world of Sakura Wars while still being directly tied to Ratchet's instigating moment. The instigating moment we have zero visibility or insight into otherwise. Sure, even with the novel's additions, Brent's still on the lower rungs of the Sakura Wars villain ladder, but Ratchet gains so much from just a few extra pages. Unfortunately, the novel isn't exactly how most people experience the story, is it? It's hard for me to recommend to anyone. For fans of the games, it at least sets things up for future games and fills in the tiny gap between 3 and 4, but for the anime-only fans, the same folks who only got to experience the series through the lens of the loosely connected OVAs and the liberally reimagined TV series, I can't imagine there's anything especially compelling for them here either. All that being said, though, it's hard for me to get too upset at this movie. It was a victim of circumstance, a fraction of what it was originally supposed to be, and it had big ambitions that it couldn't quite realize. That's not to say it's not fair to criticize it for what it is rather than what it could have or should have been, but it was an earnest, uncynical effort, and I do think that's worth something. Unfortunately, that effort was not particularly well rewarded. The movie premiered in 7th place at the Japanese box office in its first week, and only made 280 million yen against a budget of 500 million yen. Perhaps as a consequence of only being able to go see as part of the Winter Kadokawa anime Quadruple feature package. Following this disappointing theatrical run, it wouldn't be until nearly a year later in November 2002 that it finally got a home video release on VHS and DVD. Now, before I wrap things up, you know how all my videos up till now have had a segment where I describe the gameplay of each Sakura Wars entry I talk about? Unfortunately, I couldn't really do that this time. Or could I? Believe it or not, there was, in fact, a Sakura Wars the movie, the game. Kind of. Alongside its standard home video release, the movie also received a special edition DVD box set, which came with a bonus CD-ROM containing Sakura Wars the movie, Typing. That's right, a second typing game has hit the franchise. And sadly, unlike the first typing game that I ever so briefly touched upon in my GB2 video, which had its own bespoke storyline with full voice acting, this one is a more stripped down affair. The main mode has you pick a character, then cycles between stills from the movie featuring that character as you type out a line of dialogue from that scene, while the practice mode lets you play Demon Whack-A-Mole to train your key placement recognition. What's neat about it, though, is that by getting high scores for all the individual characters, you can unlock digital goodies such as special wallpapers. It's ultimately not much, but it is, by definition, an officially released Sakura Wars game, which I think at this point means I was legally obligated to at least mention it anyway. Despite December 2001 being the single busiest month in the franchise, it wasn't exactly the most fruitful one. All of the Sakura Wars releases that month saw less than stellar levels of success, regardless of their actual individual quality. And this movie didn't exactly cap the month off with a bang like it was poised to. Though later games, stage shows, and animations would go on to perform well, this particular string of releases was proof that, even at the height of its popularity, the series wasn't infallible. If nothing else though, the movie does remain an essential piece of the overall series canon, establishing characters and plot points that would be explored and go on to have greater presence in future games. Plus, it acts as the segue between Sakura Wars 3 and the next major entry in the series, the finale of the Ichiro Ogami saga, Sakura Wars 4.